All right, if you will be turning in your Bibles, we're going to start this morning in Mark chapter 14 here in just a few moments. Mark chapter 14. Character of our individual study today is a really unique individual, but I think we can learn a lot from him. Perhaps it is, hold on, let me try to word this better. I'll just go like this. We all make mistakes. And I would suggest that's the understatement of a lifetime, is it not? Is that we all make mistakes. Sometimes we make multiple mistakes in a single day. Now, is every mistake we make sinful? No. You ever made a mistake and just, or made a choice and it didn't turn out the way you wanted it to? And again, keep in mind, it might not necessarily sinful. We understand some mistakes we make are not sinful. It's just some choices we thought would turn out better. Well, they didn't turn out the way we wanted to. None of us are infallible or perfect. If we were all perfect, who would we be? We'd be God. We'd be Christ. But are we God? Are we Christ? No. We are then human. We are fallible. Because it's possible for us to make mistakes because of our choices. It is also true that we can learn from our mistakes, can we not? When you've made mistakes over the years, did you ever learn? Did you learn much from them? Oh, I have. When you're a kid and you make a mistake, you get into trouble. Well, you learn you better not do that again. So you learn from them, but you also learn, you learn how and what. And that helps us to avoid making those same mistakes in the future, does it not? You learn from the past so you don't repeat it. And that's the importance of history, is it not? Those that do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And again, we go back to our study on Wednesday night of the prophet Hosea. You look at Israel's history. Should the future generations of Israelites have learned from that first generation? Yes. So when we look at Israel's history, what do we really see in their history? They kept repeating it. And it seemed like an endless cycle over and over, almost like a broken record. And what ultimately happened because they refused to learn from the past mistakes of their forefathers? God punished them. And so history is a very valuable lesson. It offers many valuable lessons for us. And so it helps. So when we learn from our mistakes, these lessons we learn help us to avoid making those same mistakes, but they also help us to become better individuals, do they not? Because they enable us to grow. We learn, and thus we grow from these incidents. However, I would also suggest in connection with this that sometimes when we make mistakes, people can lose trust in us. And as a result, it can take time and effort to regain that trust when that mistake is made. However, on the other hand, these mistakes also give us a chance to reaffirm the trust others may still have in us. So there's a lot of moving parts that go along with this as it relates to our choices and to mistakes we make. Some may still have faith in us, and then others may simply lose faith and trust in us. And I say that to say that there is an individual who exemplifies these principles. There is an individual in the Bible, in the New Testament, that fully exemplifies what we are talking about, and his name is John Mark. What do you know about John Mark? We're going to set forth some things here in a moment by way of introduction. We'll discuss them further as we go throughout class. But what do you know about John Mark? He was Barnabas' cousin. He went on missionary journeys with Barnabas and Paul, and it's And it's at that point, Cindy, that we direct our attention to what he did on that missionary journey. He left them, that is, he departed from Paul and Barnabas in the middle of that first great mission trip. He just decided one day, I guess, to just pack up and go home. Go back to Jerusalem. And this is found in Acts 13:13, and we'll get more into that as we go throughout the lesson. Now, as we think about his decision, was it a sinful decision to want to go home, to just pack up and leave? No. It was a personal decision, but what was the result? He offended Paul. His choice led to Paul viewing him as untrustworthy. Now, how did Barnabas feel about John Mark? Still after this, wanted to take him with him. He felt strongly about him. And again, we're setting these forth as foundational points as we begin. However, when we think about their disagreement, and indeed Paul and Barnabas had a strong disagreement about John Mark, did they not? However, we're going to find that in a study of of John Mark, we're going to find that Barnabas' faith in him was rewarded, but we're also going to find that Paul's doubts about him were dispelled. We're going to find that John Mark proved Paul wrong. So, we might say that, yes, John Mark made a mistake. He would probably, and I would suggest, it's not recorded in the text, but it is possible upon returning to Jerusalem that he recognized that what he did, he probably shouldn't have done. He probably wondered to himself, why did I leave Paul and Barnabas in the middle of this trip? However, as we're going to see, he grew from that. He learned from that experience. And so that's why today, as we think about our faith and as we think about our personal growth as individual followers of Christ, that's why we need to study the life of John Mark. Truly, he is the man who bounced back. He made a decision, and it was a mistake, a decision that led to a mistake. But he also learned from it. And so today, as we examine his actions, and in particular the choice he made, which left Paul and Barnabas, as it were, in a lurch, and which led to their disagreement in their peaceful separation, we are also going to ultimately see that John Mark bounced back and became profitable not only to Barnabas, but also to Paul and other brethren. And we're going to show as Christians today, our objective in our discussion today is to show that we will from time to time make some decisions that we regret. And again, some of the mistakes we make are not necessarily sinful. We do know we do make sinful mistakes, but not all mistakes we make are necessarily sinful. But we can learn from them, and we can become more profitable service to the Lord as John Mark did. So with these thoughts in mind, let's first of all look at an introduction to this young man. And we're going to get now to Mark chapter 14. Mark, as we think about him, John Mark's name, Mark was his Roman surname, whereas John was his Hebrew name. And so that's why he has two names. In fact, it is his Roman surname that's the title of his gospel account. So John Mark did, in fact, write the Gospel of Mark. Some biblical scholars suggest that Acts chapter 12, verse 25 is the first place we learn of John Mark. Others suggest, now here's where Mark 14, 51 and 52 comes in. Others suggest that in the gospel account bearing his name, that he is the young man we read about in Mark 14, 51 and 52. And if someone would read these two verses for us, It's right after Christ has been betrayed by Judas, to be delivered into the hands of the Jews, who would ultimately deliver him up to be crucified. Notice what happens next in this account. After the disciples fled, notice next, verse 51.
A certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young man laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked.
We're told that this is a certain young man. Now, his name is not recorded. We know that. We're just giving opinion here. But some commentators have suggested that this is John Mark. In fact, as you look at the book here as well, on page 240, the author here believes that this refers to John Mark, that it is possibly John Mark that did this. Our author notes that John Mark did not refer to himself in the gospel that bears his name, as Luke and John did not appear in their records. However, in an odd incident found only in Mark, the author may, and again I think that's important to note as we quote from the author of our book, he suggests it may. He's not being dogmatic. He says he may surface momentarily. When Jesus was abducted in Gethsemane, among his disciples was a young man. Perhaps he had been rousted out of bed by news of what was happening to Jesus. He had wrapped a piece of linen cloth around himself and set out to see what was happening. It almost cost him dearly. Those who apprehended Jesus tried to seize the young man, but he slipped out of the sheet and escaped into the night. Tradition has associated the fleeing young man with Mark. Now, it is possible this could have been John Mark. It's possible, it's plausible, but again, we cannot be 100% sure. We cannot be dogmatic on this because the Bible says it's just a certain young man. We can suggest it could have been John Mark, but we cannot say definitively that it was. However, as we turn over now, when we look to what the book of Acts has to say about John Mark, when you come now to Acts chapter 12, let's turn over there now, Acts chapter 12, in verse number 25. Well, let's go to verse number 12 first. If someone would read Acts 12 and verse number 12 for us. Let's back up here. Here's what Peter does after being rescued, after being delivered by the angel of the Lord from Herod. Acts chapter 12 in verse number 12. All right, and so Peter comes to the house now of Mary, and Mary is the mother of John Mark, and hence he was a cousin of Barnabas. It's interesting to note that Mark's mother Mary was a prominent woman in the church in Jerusalem, as in William Lasore notes this in his book, Great Personalities of the Bible. And it was in her house that the disciples were praying for Peter when he had been seized by Herod. John Mark's mother was a disciple before he was, and her teaching and example more likely prepared Mark for his life of service to the Lord. Where do we read it? Do we read anything about John Mark's father? So, what other young man who was a faithful servant of the Lord do we read about whose father had no part, or the scriptures say had no part, or the scriptures don't reveal that he had a part in his spiritual training? What's that? Timothy. Lois and Eunice, his mother and grandmother, along with Mary here. What does this tell us, ladies, about the influence you can have? There you go. Amen. There you go. So it is possible for fathers to fail their children. It's possible for ungodly fathers not to have any concern for their child's spiritual well-being. But what do we see on the part of Mark? of Mary and Lois and Eunice? Did they not step up and rear their children and grandchildren in the ways of God? You think about what is said in 2 Timothy 1 verse 5 about Timothy. He had an unfeigned or a genuine faith, unpretentious faith. And the reason being is, who was it that possessed an unfeigned faith first? His grandmother and mother. And again, this is the power of example, is it not? The power of Christian influence. But especially in this context, this is dealing with the power of the influence that good Christian mothers and grandmothers can have on their children and grandchildren. As a result of their influence regarding Timothy, we're told in 2 Timothy 3 verse 15 that from a child Timothy knew what? He knew the Scriptures, which made him wise unto salvation. And so we see the powerful influence and the important role that women play in the lives of their children and grandchildren. When men fail, when the husbands, fathers fail, it's up to the women to take up the slack. And when we see the results of godly raising in the life of Timothy and John Mark. Now, we come now to verse number 25. When Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem, they come back to Antioch. Or as they return from Jerusalem, as they were returning to Antioch, who did they take with them? John Mark. They would bring him along with them. Now, I guess here's where we might discuss some things. Why do you think, what are some possibilities as to why Paul and Barnabas decided to bring John Mark with them back to Antioch? And again, the Scriptures don't give us any answers, but I think it's fun. I think we can sort of discuss this and consider some possibilities.
I think because he was kin to Barnabas, Barnabas kind of wanted to take him over and show him and teach him about God.
Take him under his wing, or teach him more about God, or sort of mentor him. I guess what we're trying to say. Am I correct, Cindy?
Right.
Perhaps as a mentor. And I think that's a good plausible explanation. Can you think of any other possible reasons? There you go. And during that time, the church needed all the missionaries they could get to carry out the gospel. So they thought, perhaps they thought, John Mark's got a lot of potential. And at this point, Paul could probably see the potential in John Mark. He's a follower of Christ. Perhaps he had zeal and enthusiasm, and he was willing to work with him. Both of those are good possible explanations. Now look at chapter 13 and verse number 5. We're skipping on down through here, but as we're noticing John Mark, as we're being introduced to him. Now look, he's given a duty. Look, if someone would read verse 5 of chapter 13 for us.
And when they arrived in Salamis, they preached the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews. They also had John as their assistant.
I like that rendering, Cindy. Thank you. The King James renders this to their minister, and I think that's sort of an awkward rendering here, because it reads, they had also John to their minister. That is a very awkward rendering of this. But again, you remember, it was translated in 1611. Now the ESV, the English Standard, reads as assisting them. Now, how did yours read, Cindy?
They also had John as their assistant.
Their assistant. I like the New King James. That's a much better rendering. Sort of in the ESV also brings out the essence of that. The American Standard Version renders it as their attendant. And again, an attendant is an assistant as well. So that's parallel terms there.
A minister is a servant.
Yes, minister.
So, in that, when I read it, tried to read it, I'm having visual problems. That's what I thought.
Well, that's true too, Sister Nana. Thank you for pointing that out.
It does sound odd.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with the term minister, but the phrase there is what is sort of clunky. It sounds how it's constructed there. And that's why it's good to, compare translations.
I think like you have to take care of them while they were preaching. They had needs that had to be seen about. Food, shelter, stuff like that. He may have assisted them in finding that kind of thing instead of actually preaching. He might have.
That's a plausible explanation, Dusty.
If he was younger, he could have had more energy.
Yeah, he was a younger man. And that's the idea here. It's the idea Mark was a helper who willingly submitted to those over them. And he performed certain duties under their direction. So he was an assistant to them. He ministered unto them. Now, what his specific duties were, we are not told. Dusty gave us some pretty good possibilities as to what they gave him to do. And certainly they would be important as well, because it would go along with what they needed in order to accomplish the preaching of the gospel. And hence, whatever these duties were, they were very important. And they were needed. Otherwise, Paul and Barnabas wouldn't have directed him to do these things, would they? Now, this makes his decision, knowing that he was doing some important duties for them. This makes what he does next really all the more shocking. And hence, let's look at the separation now. Someone would read verse number 13 of Acts chapter 13.
Now, when Paul and his party set sail from Paphos, they came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John, departing from them, returned to Jerusalem.
Here we have his departure. Now, as to the time frame after the event, after what we're told in verse number 5, that is really not known. And also what we do not know is how long he stayed with them initially. We could surmise it was a pretty good length of time, but we cannot know. Now, the verse here signifies that it is by this time that Paul's leadership is reflected. The term, his company, reflects this. Now, setting sail from Paphos, they traveled 170 miles northward to the coast of Asia Minor, a place called Perga, which was in Pamphylia, which was about 7 miles inland. And again, as the text notes, it is at this juncture that John Mark decides to leave them and return to Jerusalem. And again, we do not know the specific reason as to why he left. Now, let's ask this question. We cannot know the reason, but we can do some discussing and perhaps some speculating. What are some possible reasons as to why John Mark decided to up and go back to Jerusalem? Homesick? Hey, I've been homesick before. First time I ever went to Bible camp when I was 7 years old, I didn't make it the whole week. I had to come home, got homesick. So homesick is possible. Can you think of any other possible reasons as to why John Mark would have left them? Here's one. Herbert Lockyer, in his book, All the Men of the Bible, suggests, and again, we cannot be dogmatic on this, he suggests that it was fear of what lay ahead, an arduous missionary enterprise, which led Mark to retrace his steps. So he thinks that it was fear that led him to turn back. I don't know about that. Could have been homesickness, fear maybe. What's that?
I thought of maturity, maybe about maturity.
Yeah, immaturity. That's another good possible explanation, Ricky. So there you have it. Three possible reasons.
He might have got into, had a little argument with Paul or something, because then Barnabas was still willing to pay him and Paul wasn't. So, I don't know, he might have had a conflict with Paul.
Yeah, it could have been. I mean, we don't know. All we do know is,
We know that Paul's pretty bold, though.
yeah, he left. John Mark left. We do know that. And whatever reason that John Mark may have had for leaving, I think it's safe to assume that Paul viewed it as not being a valid reason, does he not? When we come later on, when we come down to the disagreement between him and Barnabas?
Maybe just been overwhelmed at the task.
Could have been. Just, and indeed it would be, if, being a young person not used to it, you would be overwhelmed. Could it be, though, that upon returning to Jerusalem, that when he got back home, he realized he had made a mistake in turning back? Was that question? Could it be that when he got home, he suddenly came to the realization, oh, why did I come home? I think I made a terrible decision. Why did I leave Paul and Barnabas in the middle of things when they needed my help?
Did the Lord not touch his heart?
I don't know. I mean, do you think he examined it? You think he just got to thinking, though, Ricky, that, hey, I made a mistake?
When you get to praying and thinking, you see where you're wrong.
Yeah. And again, we emphasize that his leaving was, it wasn't necessarily sinful, was it? We wouldn't say he sinned in this, but we would say that he made he made a mistake in leaving Paul and Barnabas. And perhaps, it could be he recognized this. It could be he upon prayer and thinking, he realized he made a mistake, and it made him all the more determined to serve and to make up for his error in judgment. And that's possible. Now let's come to chapter 15. Not only did John Mark separate himself from Paul and Barnabas, it ultimately led, his separation, his decision ultimately led to Paul and Barnabas separating from themselves. But ultimately, as we're going to find out, that it led to much good being accomplished. And let's read verses 35 through 41 here to set the stage for our discussion. Acts 15, 35 through 41. Anyone want to read it? All right.
Paul and Barnabas also remained in Antioch, teaching and preaching the word of the Lord with many others also. Then after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let us now go back and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord, and see how they are doing. Now Barnabas was determined to take with them John called Mark, but Paul insisted that they should not take with them the one who had departed from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. The tensions became so sharp that they parted from one another, and so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches.
Thank you, Dusty. As we think about John Mark's decision, not only did it have an effect on him personally, but it also had an effect on how Paul viewed him, did it not? And how does Paul view him with him having made the decision to turn around and go home? As a quitter. I guess that's about the easiest, simplest way to put it. It's interesting to note on page 241 of the book how long Paul and Barnabas extended their missionary tour is unclear. By most estimates, their travels through Central Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey, took them perhaps a year and a half. They began and ended the trip at Antioch. So returning to Antioch, they continued preaching the gospel for an extended period, according to 14 verse 28, and perhaps for a year or longer. So they had that lengthy preaching trip, then they came home to Antioch, and they stayed there for quite a bit of time before deciding here to begin a second missionary journey, here in verse 36. And what was the purpose of this next great preaching trip? What was their original goal, according to this verse?
To visit the churches that are already established.
See how they're growing?
Yeah, to go back and strengthen them, check on everybody.
I think it should be noted too that John, if he went all the way back to Jerusalem and then came back to them in Antioch, that was a pretty good journey. Another journey for him to come back.
Oh, that was. That was a very good, I think that's something we often overlook too, Dusty. I'm glad you brought that out. So he traveled a whole long way to get back to Paul and Barnabas. Now, again, as you noted that, as we look at verse 37, we see the determination. And again, we might see family ties coming out in this, do we not? Barnabas wanted to take John Mark. Now remember, how were they related? They were cousins. So we do see family ties, and family will stick up for others. And so Barnabas still had faith. He trusted John Mark. Whereas Paul was determined to not allow him to go, since Mark had previously left them. It's interesting to note, when you go back to chapter 13 and verse 13, and you look at the term there for what Mark did, departing from them, the Greek word there is the idea of standing apart from. In the context, it would mean to desert. So Paul, in the eyes of Paul, John Mark was a quitter. He just simply deserted them. But can we see why both sides felt the way they did? Can we see why Paul felt the way he felt toward John Mark? Why we could see why Paul would not want to take John Mark. But we can also see why Barnabas would want to take John Mark. His family. His blood kin.
Well, don't we today, if a brother or sister does say what we consider a bad sin, but something that we don't like, and they come back and confess, sometimes it's hard to get that out of your mind.
Sometimes it is, but we have to.
I mean, you have to, but that plays in your mind.
It does.
That you don't forget the sin.
Mm-hmm. And remember, what John Mark did here was not necessarily sinful, as we pointed out. But even then, it's hard. Paul doesn't want to forget. It's hard to forget what he did, what happened. And as a result, what happens between Paul and Barnabas here? The contention was so sharp between them.
Well, I'd like to say something in defense of Barnabas.
All right.
In other studies, he's always been an encourager.
He is.
And sort of a catalyst between bringing people together. And I just think that if the Lord had wanted us to know the reason, I can't really know when he left. And obviously Paul was judgmental here, and Barnabas just took up for him.
Mm-hmm.
But Barnabas' character, I keep thinking, well, he must have had a very good reason. And Barnabas, as his kinfolks, would do.
Mm-hmm. Well, what we
And
see
it
here.
could be because Paul was adamant about it. So when we get a fuss, it's better for one to walk away.
Mm-hmm. And they could in this case. This wasn't a matter of doctrine, was it? This is a matter of personal opinion. And again, and I think it's interesting to note, here you have an apostle of Christ, Paul. Here in this, argument with Barnabas. And again, this shows, even the faithful, we can,
Rather than go different someplace.
yeah, this is personal opinion.
You gotta agree to disagree.
Yeah, and that's what they did. They resolved the matter by agreeing to disagree. Now, did their separation permanently affect their love and respect for one another? Absolutely not.
I think they got twice as much work done,
They did.
you know.
Now, notice also, later on, Paul would write the first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 9 and verse 6. This is after this took place, and in that chapter, Paul spoke of Barnabas as being worthy of support. So they had a disagreement, but they did not let it affect them personally or spiritually. Did they argue? I would suggest they did. But, they settled their difference. And the best thing they came to the solution was, hey, let's just go our separate ways. In this case, we can agree to disagree. And they didn't hold grudges. That's so easy to fall into when we have disagreements, is to hold grudges, is it not? But I think what happens here with Paul and Barnabas offers us the lesson, how to handle personal disagreements without holding grudges. Just agree to disagree and move on if it's a matter of judgment. Because we see what happened. As Ricky, you pointed out, twice as much was accomplished. The gospel was being preached in even more places due to their separation. You look at this, both men took different partners. Barnabas took John Mark and Paul took whom? Silas. So now, instead of having one great missionary team, you have two. Twice what you had before.
What's the meaning of that, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God? They did for Paul and Silas, they didn't say they did for Barnabas and Mark.
Well, I think that's the idea that Silas was recommended, when that he was as trustworthy and able as Barnabas was. I would think that's the meaning here. That you can count on Silas just as you could count on Barnabas. He's going to be working with Paul. That's a question. That's something I never thought of, Dusty. I'm glad you asked that. But I think that's what's going on here in that verse, this recommendation. And perhaps it is the idea that, and it could also be the idea that Paul chose Silas because Silas was recommended by the brethren there.
I think the main thing, you see both of them as faithfulness to serve the Lord.
Exactly. That's the main thing. As you pointed out, Ricky, that is the main thing. And so, though they had the book notes that Paul and Silas set out on a trip that would eventually take them to mainland Greece. Barnabas, accompanied by Mark, sailed west to visit churches on Cyprus. By God's providence, one missionary team became two. There you go, providence, that mysterious working. Though they had a disagreement, Paul and Barnabas did not let that hinder them from doing the work of the Lord, did it? Though now separate and apart from one another. And we see the results. See, good can come from personal disagreements, as we see here. Now, let's now look, having looked at this separation, let's see how John Mark bounced back. And now let's look down through time and let's see his commendation. Because John Mark, I don't think he had to redeem himself in the eyes of Barnabas, but to the eyes of the other brethren, he did. In particular, in the eyes of Paul. When he went with his cousin, when he went with Barnabas on this second trip, Scriptures do not say it, but I think we can infer that he did not depart as he did on that first trip, can we not? Would it be safe to say that this time John Mark stuck it out with Barnabas? And I think the evidence is there. Because look in time, look at Paul's recognition of John Mark's usefulness. Look at Colossians chapter 4 and verse number 10. Look at this. Look at these words of commendation to John Mark, to the Colossian brethren about John Mark. Paul here writes, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you. And Marcus, and we know this is John Mark, sister's son to Barnabas, teaching whom ye receive commandments, if he come unto you, receive him. So in other words, Paul is telling the brethren, if John Mark comes to you, do what? Welcome him. Now what's Paul saying here about John Mark that he didn't the previous time, the last time we saw him and Barnabas together? He's recommended John Mark. Welcome him, receive him. Now let's come to the close of Paul's life, 2 Timothy 4, verse 11. Again, we know that 2 Timothy was the last epistle that Paul wrote. And he wrote it prior to being executed. In verse number 11, Paul tells Timothy, and he's encouraging Timothy to come shortly unto him. And he says that only Luke is with me. Now, who does he want to bring? Who does Paul want Timothy to bring to him? Bring Mark with you. Now, notice what he says about Mark here. For he is what? Profitable to me for the ministry. Look at this. At one time, John Mark had been what in the sight of Paul? A disappointment. Unprofitable. Now he is viewed by Paul how? As useful. This shows to us that John Mark had grown. He had matured in his faith. Has he not? He had learned and he had become more fruitful in his service to the Lord. And so in reality, the faith of Barnabas and John Mark was paid off. This tells us that though others may disappoint us, let's never be too quick to dismiss them, though they make mistakes. You see, our faith and trust in others can be repaid, as Barnabas' faith was by John Mark. And certainly he redeemed himself in the eyes of Paul. And of course, we add the last reference to Peter. We won't get into that. But as we close, a study of John Mark's life is very encouraging for many reasons. It shows to us that no one is above making, as I put it, not a single one of us is above making stupid or boneheaded decisions. And certainly he made one in leaving Paul and Barnabas in the middle of their preaching trip. Again, it shows to us that we are all human. We make mistakes. But it shows to us we can bounce back from whatever bad decision we make. We don't have to be discouraged. We don't have to feel defeated. We can learn from our mistakes. We can grow and thus become more profitable in our service to God as John did. It shows to us we can prove the doubters wrong. Paul proved those who doubted his conversion wrong. Ironically, it was John Mark who proved Paul wrong in returning to faithful service and bouncing back from his departure in the middle of a mission trip. Mark offers to us an example of a young man who got off to a shaky start, but who showed himself in time to be an outstanding worker in the kingdom of God. As Christians today, whenever we make a mistake, let us take heart and let us look at the life of John Mark, who made a mistake but bounced back in greater service to God.